All right, so we're going to pick up right where we left off this time last week, and we got through the first two plagues. Hopefully we can pick up a little bit more steam and get through the next seven. So we will pick up in verse 16 of chapter 8. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt." And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. All right, so this is our third plague, and this is the end of the first set. So some Bible scholars will break the first 9 plagues into 3 different sets of 3. We'll look at that here in a minute. This is the end of that first set. So we had the water turning to blood, we had the plague of the frogs, and now we have these gnats or lice. This is the plague that really kind of gets the least amount of screen time, if you will. There's not a lot mentioned about it, but what little there is that's said of it is very important. This is one of my favorite, not because I think it would be a great plague, but I really like seeing what Moses, through God, chooses to say about this plague here in Exodus chapter 8. And as we've been doing for the other plagues, as we'll continue to do for these first 9 plagues, we will see that God is showing his power in Egypt over all of the gods of Egypt and over Pharaoh himself. And so this one is over the god Geb or Jeb, who is the god of dust and earth. And we will see that that is an important phrase here and an important theme in this plague. Because God tells them, Moses and Aaron, to essentially create this next plague, these gnats, out of the dust of the earth. And this is going to be a little bit of a callback to something that we talked about on Sunday of last week. So most of the time that we hear this phrase or read this phrase in the Bible, it's a fairly, I think, common phrase for us to think about, the dust of the earth. Almost all of the times that we see this in the Bible, it is referring to God's power to either create life or to take away life. And we see that this is going to be used time and time again in this aspect of God bringing forth human life from the dust of the earth. And also a reminder time and time again throughout most of the Old Testament of this is all that you are. You're just the dust of the earth. And so it's really interesting to me that God, through Moses and Aaron, says, you're going to create these gnats. And so let's look back at what we talked about last week in Exodus chapter 7. The very beginning of Exodus 7, God tells Moses, I'm going to make you like God to Pharaoh. And we talked about some of the implications of that, some of maybe what that means. But here we're going to see the limitation of that. Because even though God is making Moses like God to Pharaoh, the only thing that Moses is ever going to be able to create from the dust of the earth is a gnat. And that to us is the most insignificant of things, right? We will use that terminology. We'll talk about gnats as being just the tiniest, most minuscule type of bug. Right? And so it's really interesting to see that, one, the only thing that through God that Moses and Aaron are able to create is this tiny little bug. Right? Nothing of significance as we think about it. The other really interesting thing is this is the first plague that we see that the Egyptian magicians can't do. And that's going to lead to them declaring that this is the work of God. They say this has to be the finger of God. And so we see that up to this point, they've been able to, by whatever their secret arts are, do the first two plagues in some form or another, right? So however they turn the water to blood, even before that, even how they turn their staff into a snake, and then how they summon frogs. We don't know, but what we do know is they weren't able to solve the problem. So we see that, yes, they were able to do these things, but they weren't able to take away the things that were afflicting them. Here, they can't do either. And I think part of that might be because this is the first time really that we see God channeling through Moses and Aaron this idea of they are creating something. They are doing something that only God can do. And the Egyptians see that. Most of the Egyptians see that. Pharaoh, on the other hand, does not. His heart is still hardened by this. All right, any questions or comments about this plague, or we can even go back to the first three plagues before we move on. Yes? Yep.
You know, the plagues, as we know, the purpose was for God's name, power, and glory to be proclaimed. We see that in Exodus chapter 9, verse 16, where he raised Egypt up. The purpose is showing his power for his name to be proclaimed. You know, something else that I think many times that we look at Pharaoh and we see him, we think of him as the exception with his hardness of his heart, but in reality, he's the rule that we see throughout time and history, even today, that the hardness of man's heart comes from not humbling himself before God. We're going to obey God on our own terms, and for that repentance that should take place isn't that radical change that God expects. So that hardness of heart is something that we can relate to.
Yeah, Brother Joe brings up a really good point of a lot of times when we're looking at this story in particular of Pharaoh, we kind of see him as the exception of the rule. Like everyone else gets it, his heart is hard, and he just doesn't get it. But as we're going to see really throughout history, he's kind of the rule, right? Humanity is wont to harden their heart, and we will see this time and time again. And this is going to come back into play several times throughout the plagues. And we're going to make specific reference back to the passage that you mentioned about God using these to show Egypt who he is in a little bit. Yep, very good point. All right, so like I mentioned, a lot of scholars will break these plagues into three different sets. The first 9 plagues into sets of 3. So we've got set 1 is the water to blood, the frogs, and then the gnats, which we've covered. And then we're going to get into these last 2 sets, which are flies, the livestock dying, and boils, and then hail, locust, and darkness. And one, just as people, we're always looking for patterns, right? And we also very much like patterns of 3. And so I think that that's some of why this is... people break this down this way is because we like to see sets of 3. There's tons of sets of 3 in the Bible. But I want to look at a couple of these things sort of in the scope of all of the plagues, the first 9 plagues, all of them together, to maybe give us a little bit of some foundation of what's going on here as we move forward to these last 6 plagues. So, breaking these into sets, we will see a couple of patterns will emerge through these. The first one is that the first 2 of each of these sets is preceded with a warning. So God sends Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh, this plague is about to happen, then the plague happens. The third one of each set is not preceded with the warning. It's just God tells Moses and Aaron, and they make it happen. So we might think, why? It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I think part of it is, my thinking would be, why is God even warning them in the first place? Right? Why not just smite them with these plagues to teach them a lesson? Well, I think that they wouldn't learn the lesson quite as much if they didn't know who this was coming from. And so to see that God not only has the power to do these plagues, but to predict them completely accurately ahead of time and say, this is what's going to happen, I think that's going to speak a little bit louder to most of the Egyptians than if he just sent these random plagues. The first set, it doesn't mention anything about the Israelites, the land of Goshen, being separate or being unaffected by the plagues. We're not going to really see that explicitly mentioned in the text until the start of this second set with the flies, which we'll get to in a minute. And so, one, that's going to raise some questions about what were the Israelites going through during this first set of plague, but I think even more importantly, it's going to raise a lot of questions in the Egyptians' minds once the second set starts of why are these things not happening in the land of Goshen, where God's chosen people are. And then finally, we get the first two sets. There's only one plague in each of these that sort of calls Pharaoh to action. In the other two plagues of each of those sets, it says his heart is hardened and nothing happens. He doesn't choose to do anything. Once we get to set 3, all 3 of those plagues spark him to some kind of statement or action that is going to get him closer and closer and closer to letting the people of God go. And so we're going to see that. And so what I want to do really quickly before we move on to the next set of plagues is I want to look at Pharaoh's 5 responses that he has to the plagues that call him to action. Because we see that there's 1 from set 1, 1 from set 2, and all 3 from set 3. And so he's going to have 5 responses to Moses in response to these 5 plagues that really strike him in a certain way. And I want to see what his response is and maybe tie it into responses that we can have from time to time. All right, so the first one is after the frogs. And he says, "Take the frogs away, and I will let the people go." So this is your classic quid pro quo. If you do something, I will do something in return. I think a lot of times this is how we approach our obedience, right? We will say, okay, God, if you will do this thing for me, I will stop sinning, or I will start going to church more, or I will whatever, right? It's this classic case of, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and let's make sure that I'm getting something, I'm benefiting from my obedience. That's Pharaoh's first response to these plagues, is, okay, if you will agree to do what I want, then sure, I'll let your people go. And then, of course, we know that as soon as the frogs go away, he turns around and says, never mind. So then we get to the second one, and he says, I will let you go sacrifice to your God, only you must not go very far. Right? So this is obedience on our terms. We say, okay, here are the stipulations. Maybe it's not that I'm getting something out of it, but I just want to obey on my own terms. And Pharaoh's doing that here of saying, as long as you're following my protocols, you can go and do whatever. And I think that that's another trap that sometimes we may fall into is we set the terms when really we should be letting God set the terms. Then the next time, he relents a little bit to these plagues. He says, this time I have sinned. And we're going to see that all of these cases are temporary, but this one he explicitly says, okay, this time I messed up. So his obedience is just temporary. And that's not what God calls us to. Right? He doesn't call us just to, okay, just obey real quickly, just get baptized and then you're good. You never have to obey again, right? What we're going to see through Pharaoh's example is that even when he does the thing that God has been calling him to do over and over and over again, let my people go, as soon as he sees that they're gone, he's going to turn around and try to get them back. Next, this isn't Pharaoh, this is the Egyptians saying this. Let the men go. Do you not understand that Egypt is ruined? The people of Egypt come to Pharaoh and say this. And so he, at this point, relents, says, okay, If you take away the plagues, I'll let them go. Right? So he is peer pressured into obedience, which is not true obedience. Right? If somebody else is forcing you to do something, and we're going to see that that's, this whole idea of free will and God wanting us to serve him because we love him, that's going to be actually a constant theme throughout these plagues, and why we make mention to Pharaoh's hard heart so often. And then finally, after the plague of darkness, he says, "Get away from me. On the day you see my face, you shall die." And we see that at this point, he's just driven to an ultimatum of despair. He says, "I'm never going to be able to please you, to do what you want, so get away from me. I don't ever want to see you again." So I think that these are all traps that we can find ourselves in if we're approaching our obedience and our relationship to God in the wrong ways. And so that's just something that I kind of wanted to bring out of. These are the ways that Pharaoh responds when he is shown different types of adversity. And I think that they are pretty applicable to us as well. So before we move on to the rest of the plagues, do we have any questions or comments about sort of the scope of the plagues as a whole and how Pharaoh responded to them?
Real quick, going through what you were just saying, it shows the character of God too,
Mm-hmm.
mercy. He could have went straight to the 10th plague,
Yeah.
but instead he showed his mercy, and there were some relenting. When we see in the 3rd plague, with saying this is the finger of God, to the 7th one, we see hail. And
Right.
the servants are saying, "Hey, we got to get him in there. This is really going to happen."
Yeah.
So I think that goes to show you that through history, even if you think of Jonah and the great story that could have happened,
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't have repented what God may have created to cause them to have been inflicted upon them.
Yeah. Yeah, really good point. Joe brings up again that this is not just us learning about Pharaoh's character through these. It's us really learning about God's character, because through these plagues, he's trying to make a point to Egypt. And there are some people that get that point and they repent, or at least they understand this is God, we're in over our heads. Pharaoh, he's not getting it though. All right, let's then move on to the next plague. Starting in verse 20. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, and say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. Or else if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and your people and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen.' And the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses. Throughout all the land of Egypt the land was ruined by the swarms of flies. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, 'Go, sacrifice to your God within the land.' But Moses said, 'It would not be right to do so, for the offerings we shall sacrifice to the Lord our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice offerings abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he tells us.' So Pharaoh said, 'I will let you go to sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you must not go very far away. Plead for me.' Then Moses said, 'Behold, I am going out from you, and I will plead with the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only let not Pharaoh cheat again by not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord.' So Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did as Moses asked, and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. Not one remained. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and did not let the people go." So here, this one I think is the one that's the biggest stretch. We see that there is an Egyptian god named Khepri, the god of creation. The relationship here is that Khepri is depicted as having the head of a fly. And so some people say that this could have been in sort of response to that? I don't know, but that's the connection that some scholars make. All right, this is the first plague that is presented to Pharaoh without any accompanying act from Moses or Aaron. He doesn't make Moses or Aaron go out with the staff and wave it over the water or call up the dust, right? It's just this swarm of flies appears and starts wreaking havoc in Egypt. And as we see, this is also the first plague where God explicitly says this is not going to happen to my people, and we see that the land of Goshen is not affected at all. So when we were talking about the frogs on last Sunday, I kind of pulled out this section of the scripture that said the frogs were on Pharaoh, on all of his household, and on all of his servants. And we said that that might be referring to the Israelites. Here we see, though, that it still is making mention of his household and his servants, but we know that the Israelites are spared. So it seems to me that this is just talking about the servants that are working in Pharaoh's palace, in his residence, and they're most likely just Egyptian servants. And this is really where we see, we say this phrase all the time, let my people go, let my people go, right? We see Moses saying this time and time again. We see Aaron saying it to Pharaoh. Really, in this plague, this is the first time that when I'm reading this, I see God not using Moses and Aaron as sort of a proxy for these plagues, but he is saying, these are my people, and you are going to let them go because of what I am doing to Egypt. And so this is a really powerful reminder that God is always in control, and he's showing that in a number of different ways to Pharaoh. And in this instance, he's saying, this is me. This is my power, and these are my people, and you're powerless against me, and you're going to let them go. All right, questions or comments about that? Yes, Abraham.
Just kind of going back to your structure with the groups
Okay.
that kind of stood out. It's also interesting to see there's almost like 3 locations of origins for the plagues. So like the first 2 start out with water and Nile, but then we get dust from the earth, and then the rest are from the earth. And then what we'll get to soon is like the boils, like soot is thrown in the air, and then all of the last plagues kind of come from the sky. And I almost wonder, like, if you're pointing out like the structures telling us some stuff, seeing water, land, and sky is like God is over all creation.
Yeah.
Just like he made all 3 of those areas, even within these plagues, God has the power over all those sections.
Yeah, so Abraham brings up that there's sort of an additional connection between some of these sets of plagues, and that's sort of where they originate. So some of them originate in the water. We see the Nile. And some of them originate with the earth, the dust of the earth, or the soot, or whatever that might be. And then some of them originate or come from the air, the sky, on the wind, as we'll see the locusts say. And so, in Egyptian culture, that was all segmented out, right? Different gods controlled different aspects of this. Yahweh is saying, no, I control all of it, right? It doesn't matter where what God controls what. He's like, I control all of this, and I'm going to be able to bring about things from any of these different aspects of nature. Yeah, really good point. All right, let's then read, let's start chapter 9, the 5th plague. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock that are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. All right, so here we see that God is exemplifying his power over Hathor, the goddess of protection. We see her depicted lots of times with the head of a cow or a calf, but also she was sort of the goddess that was believed to protect all of the animals and all of the humans, and we're going to see that she is powerless against this plague. And it's interesting that in this plague and in the next plague, it's almost as if Pharaoh doesn't even care, right? It seems like he's gotten to the point where he's not even going to blink at these plagues. These things are going to happen, and he's like, so what? The people of Egypt, however, would not be this way. Even if we can see, okay, maybe, they can deal with the frogs, they could deal with the gnats and the flies, this one's going to be a lot harder for them to deal with because this was their livelihood. We're going to see that all of these cattle that were mentioned, we've got the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, the flocks. This isn't just their food, right? This is food, transportation, their military, as we're going to see later on in the book of Exodus. They use them for agriculture, and the bull in Egypt was the holiest of animals, right? And so this is going to be a real blow to the people of Egypt, seeing all of these aspects of their civilization wiped out. And so I want to talk about this very quickly before we move on to the next one, because in verse 6 of chapter 9, it says, all the livestock of the Egyptians died. And when I read that, initially I take that to mean every single horse and camel and donkey and cow and sheep and whatever in Egypt was gone, was wiped out. But then we get to a few verses later, in chapter 9, verse 19, we look at 11:5. Chapter 9 and 19, right, they are told to bring all of their livestock inside. The people go to the people of Egypt and say, you got to bring your livestock inside, or else the hail is going to kill them. How did they have livestock? Didn't it all just die? When we get to chapter 11, we're going to see the firstborn of all of Egypt, the people and their livestock died. So there had to be some livestock, right? In chapter 14, we're going to see that Pharaoh's army chases after Moses and the Israelites with what? Chariots and horses, right? Well, we see that in verse 4, or verse 3 of chapter 9, horses were one of the things that were afflicted. And so I don't think that this causes a problem at all for us when we're reading this. The word all that is used here in the Hebrew is used in two different ways throughout Moses' writing. Sometimes he uses it to mean all, everything, every individual item. Sometimes he uses it to mean all kinds. So all kinds of livestock died. But also, that's not the point of this plague. The point is referenced many more times than just the livestock dying. The point, it seems to me, to this plague is, in verse 7, is when it's mentioned the last time. It says, Pharaoh sent, behold. He wasn't checking to see how many of his livestock died. He was checking to see how many of the Israelites' livestock died. And how many was it? None of them. That, I think, is the point of this plague, is to show that God is just working against the Egyptians at this point. And so I think that this plague was a severe blow to them because I think a lot of their livestock died. But we don't have to take that and say, well, if all of their livestock died, then what are these other things? Why are there still livestock around? I think there's an easy explanation for that. Any questions or comments about that? Yes? Yeah, so Joan brings up the point that perhaps they just stole the livestock from the Israelites, and I think that that's a possibility. Later on in Exodus, we're going to see that God calls the Israelites to actually take their own livestock and leave. And so that may be a call to take back your livestock from the Egyptians, or it may be because he knows that they would be tempted to do that. So yeah, that's a very valid point. Other thoughts? All right, let's move on to verse 8. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt." So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So again, we see that doesn't even seem to affect Pharaoh at all, right? The blow just glances right off of him, and he still has a hard heart. And so, right, I'm sure that some of the magicians and the priests of Pharaoh and all of them were praying to Isis, the goddess of medicine, and nothing was helping these boils. There's an interesting reference to taking the soot from the kiln and throwing it into the air. And there's been a lot of speculation about why this is, why not just cause boils to come up. One of the more interesting ones to me mentions that these kilns that would have been around this area were the same ones that the Israelites would have used to make the bricks that we read about earlier in the book. And so God is showing that through all of this hard toil and labor of the Israelites, it was not in vain. This is a message not only to the Egyptians, but also to the Israelites. And the Israelites are going to be spared from this, and so that's going to be something that's going to be important going forward. Yes, Brother Brown.
Yes, the Pharaoh and quite a few others are also leaders and rulers, saying, who is the Lord? And who is he? And, but God has a proof pudding. The proof is in the taste of the pudding. Proof. And God has his proof that he is the Almighty.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Brother Herman says that, a lot of times we're going to see that there's these rulers that are either oppressing Israel or whatever, and they're asking for proof. They're saying, okay, who is this God that you're serving? And as Brother Herman mentioned, the proof is in the pudding. God is saying, here's how you know that I am the Almighty God. Yeah, very good. We're also going to see here that it's not just the Israelites that are feeling the oppression from this, right? The Egyptians are very much now feeling this economically, as we saw with the last plague, but they're also feeling it physically now. They're becoming very uncomfortable by these plagues, and Pharaoh's not showing any empathy, right? And that's just another aspect of his hard heart, is that even the people that he is supposed to be ruling over, not in like a sense of a taskmaster like we saw against the Israelites, but the people that serve him, the people that worship him, he's not showing any empathy toward them. And then I'll also just mention there were still beasts of some kind that were getting boils. So however we are going to explain that, we see that this plague affected, it seems like, every living thing in Egypt, but not Goshen. All right, for the next two plagues, the sections are very long, so we're not going to read them verse by verse. But I'll put the passages, just the verse numbers, up on the screen. I would highly recommend you going through and reading these on your own time. But I want to talk about these two plagues quickly, the plague of hail and the plague of locusts. Like I said, the sections are very long. And just maybe call out a couple things that we don't necessarily think of when we're studying these in like Sunday school. One of the things that is mentioned is that it wasn't just hail, but it was accompanied by thunder and with fire. I don't ever really remember that in like the Abeka poster drawings that we had up on the board in Sunday school of fiery hail. But this is a terrifying image. This is not just little ice cubes falling out of the sky and damaging some crops. This is seems like countrywide type of storm that would have damaged virtually everything. And we get this passage in the middle of this chapter where it says, "Such hail had never been seen in all of Egypt since it became a nation." And so really quickly, I just want to bring up a couple things that historians and scientists try to use to explain away the plagues. Because if we need to be honest about this, there's not a lot of record in Egyptian documentation about the plagues. And so one of the things we can say about that is, okay, well, then they didn't happen. If this happened in our country today, it would be all over the news. We would have documents about it forever, right? Well, we know that the Egyptians kept pretty good records. They also only kept records that made them look good. They didn't really record a lot of stuff that made them seem inferior to things. So there's that. The other thing is that a lot of scientists will say that these plagues follow some kind of natural progression of maybe something like a volcanic explosion. So there was in Greece a volcano that exploded in the 16 to 1500 BC, around the time that we think this was going on. And they say all of this was just kind of a snowball effect of that. All these plagues seem like naturally they kind of come in this order. To that, I would say that that shouldn't cause us any problems as Christians for a couple reasons. One, even if this is all natural occurrences, who created nature, right? Who created all of these laws in which all of this stuff happened? The second thing I would say to that is, there's a lot of holes in those theories with that. Once we get to the 10th plague, though, every historian that I've read, every scientist that I've read that's trying to explain away the plagues can't with the 10th one. They said there's no natural explanation for the 10th plague at all. But the other thing, the reason that I mention this here is because this is the one that we have the most documentation from Egypt at that time of. There was a very severe hailstorm during this time that destroyed much of the land around Goshen. And we see that in extra biblical documents. And so even if we, dismiss the fact that there's not a lot of historical record, there is for this one. And so I just wanted to mention that. And, like Brother Joe mentioned earlier, this is the plague that God explicitly says, I am using you guys. I'm using Egypt to show everybody who I am. And so we're going to see that now most of the people of Egypt are on board. They're like, yes, we got to get these people out of here. But we're still going to see that Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened after the plague relents. But before that, he's going to make this admission. The Lord is right. Yeah, Brother Ryan.
Kind of interesting with this that if Pharaoh originally would have just said, sure, you can have the people, I don't want them, his own people would have only known of him as the power.
Right.
But through all of this, they fixated a lot of attention on this God that's come in and really wreaked havoc on Egypt, and probably thinking poorly of him. And after all this is over, you kind of wonder what the people really think of Pharaoh.
Yeah.
What you've done to this place with your pride and wanting to withstand God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point of if Pharaoh had just early on said, just let him go, right? He could have done that from a place of power and his people still would have respected him, right? And thought that he was the God king that was making these decisions. But he let it go so long that they were able to see who was really in control, who was really in charge. Yeah, really good point. All right, next we've got the plague of locusts. And this is the first 20 verses of chapter 10. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. So kind of to Abraham's point, we're going to see now that God specifically, through Moses, says, okay, this is coming on by the wind, right? So we see that there's a lot of wind and storm analogies in this last set of plagues. So he uses an east wind to bring the locusts to Egypt. He uses a west wind to drive the locusts away into the Red Sea. And this plague is so cool the way it's structured, because it foreshadows Pharaoh and his army in the language that is used. It seems almost intentional, and it very well may have been. But let's just look at a couple of these really quickly. So beforehand, before each of these instances, before the plague of locusts and before the Israelites cross the Red Sea, the people are complaining against their leader. In the first one, the Egyptians are complaining against Pharaoh. They're saying, you got to let these people go. They're ruining Egypt. In chapter 14 and verse 10 through 12, the Israelites are already grumbling and complaining against Moses. So then we see that an east wind is going to come and bring a sign or a miracle. Right? So in 10:13, the east wind brings the plague of locusts onto the land. In 14 verse 21, an east wind is what comes and separates the Red Sea, parts of the Red Sea. Same exact phrase. And then this is where I think it gets really cool. In 10:19, once the west wind comes and takes the locust away, it drives them into the Red Sea and says not a single one of them remained. In 14:27 and 28, what happens? Pharaoh's armies rush into the Red Sea. The east wind stops, the Red Sea closes, and it says that same exact phrase. Not a single one of Pharaoh's army remained. Really cool that this is just, beat for beat foreshadowing of what is going to happen to Pharaoh and his army. And then real quickly, we'll just talk about darkness. I know we're almost out of time. This one, even if, I'm a little skeptical about all of these connections with the gods of Egypt, but this one, I think, Ra, the god of the sun, was one of the main deities other than Pharaoh that all of the Egyptians would have worshipped. And so saving this for basically last until the main plague, the last plague, I think really shows that God is in control of all aspects of nature and Egypt. It says a darkness to be felt, and then it says pitch darkness. I think we use pitch darkness all the time. That's a phrase we use, but what that really means is darkness that is so thick it's like pitch. It's almost like sticky darkness. That's the phrase that's used here. I don't know what that means, but that's a really visceral image of that. And then very quickly, we see throughout all of these plagues, all of really this Pharaoh's history, is that his constant weakness is his sight. Right? We mentioned this last week. We mentioned this a couple weeks ago of every time he sees that the plagues are gone, his heart is hardened again. And so the only adequate precursor to the Passover and all that brought was for God to completely take away Pharaoh's sight. And only then is he really, truly going to see what is going on. And so, on Wednesday, we will pick up there. Jeremy will be talking about the last plague and the Passover. Thank you all very much for your attention, your questions, and your comments.